Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the last installment of the fair housing webinars we've had this month on the platform, The Color of Real Estate. Now, I want to say right off the bat that our webinar is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, you know what to do. We want to thank our panelists for agreeing to be a part of this platform and to share with us their knowledge about co-ops and exactly how they see it, where they see it going, and what we can do as realtors and the general public to help move any sort of legislation forward and be a part of the conversation. So I have three major bios here. You know, some of these, they're too accomplished for me to read everything. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about, starting with Catherine Borgia, who is our current Westchester County legislator with legislation out that is being discussed regarding co-ops. She's also a realtor with Keller Williams. And I'm going to have Catherine tell you a little bit about herself. And then, of course, we can always add to it as we go. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you. So I have been a realtor for 4 years and a county legislator for 10 years. But I've always been interested in fairness in housing issues. So the piece of legislation that I am completing, I hope this month or May, is something that I've been involved in almost for as long as I've been on the Board of Legislators prior to my experience. But of course, being a realtor and being on both sides of co-op transactions has really hit home for me, the fact that we need to have a more transparent and better process for co-op sales.
Excellent. So, Thank you very much. Awesome. We also have Tessa Hultz, who is the Long Island Board of Realtors CEO and comes also with a different perspective because she doesn't sell real estate at all. So go ahead, Tessa, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. My name is Tessa Hultz, and I've been the CEO of the Long Island Board of Realtors for a little over 2 years. But I've been in real estate for 16 and serving as CEO for Realtor associations for about the last 10. You know, affordable housing, fair housing, getting people who are ready, willing, and able to make a commitment to homeownership into homes is one of the most defining characteristics in a person's life. Health outcomes, educational outcomes, you know, wealth outcomes are all related to this. So there's really not a more important topic that we could talk about homeownership. And here in New York, co-ops is a big part of that. So I'm really glad to be part of the discussion today.
Outstanding. Thanks a lot. And our very own esteemed David Legaz, who is our current New York State Association of Realtors president. And he's going to say a little bit about himself. Of course, he was in another life was a police officer. So we like that. Lots of safety on the table. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Dorothy. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been a licensee for 25 years. I'm with Keller Williams Realty. I service pretty much all of New York City, Queens, and Manhattan. And 75% of my business is the selling of co-ops. So I'm definitely understand and appreciate what we need in terms of transparency for co-ops.
Thank you very much. And we're going to get right into it because we are here to really discuss the meat and potatoes of co-ops. We say co-ops because it is what we are used to. It's cooperative. So again, I'm going to have Tessa give us a clear definition of what a co-op is, what a cooperative is, and how the general public and realtors define that.
Sure. So I pulled up a definition, and yet cooperative housing is the full phrase, but we do use co-op so that it flows a little better. I think that this was a really good definition. A co-op is a way to own a primary residence, but where the homeowner doesn't actually buy the unit outright. Instead, they're a shareholder in the cooperative itself. So that both explains the legal aspect of it. They're buying shares, not a unit. The unit is part of owning the shares, but it is seen as a primary residence. It is a home ownership aspect. It is an avenue to owning your home.
You know, I think when we look at co-ops as a realtor from this end of things, you know, I look at a co-op when somebody comes in, I see that, okay, it's great pricing. It's affordable, but yet really not everybody gets in. What is it with this choosing of our neighbors? Why are we selecting our neighbors? Catherine, go for that. Why?
So what the associations that represent co-ops would say is that you're not really choosing your neighbors, you're choosing your business partners because you don't own real property, you own shares in the co-op. But what we think at the Westchester County Board of Legislators is that's not an argument that really holds a lot of water, except with respect to meeting financial needs that you do have to pre-qualify people the same way you have to pre-qualify people for every real estate transaction, that they are financially able to complete the transaction. So this is a piece of legislation that's been around for actually a very long time. The woman who first introduced this legislation in Westchester County was Lois Bronze, who was our first woman chair of the Board of Legislators. She introduced it more than 20 years ago, and it's been carried by several legislators of prominence, including Andrea Stewart Cousins, who is now the majority leader in the New York State Senate. It's been carried by Ken Jenkins, who's our deputy county executive. It was carried by Senator Pete Harcum, who is now a state senator. And then I always supported it and kind of inherited it as all of those legislators moved on. So 2 years ago, we had a big negotiation with the BRI and other organizations representing co-op boards, and came up with part one, I'm going to call it. So one of the problems that we know as realtors is that sometimes these transactions take so long, and part of the problem is that the boards either don't tell you what they need, or they don't say that your application is incomplete, or they don't meet frequently enough. I had a sale where I was selling to a young couple, and the woman was a teacher, and she wanted to be in her new home to get ready. And they told us that they can't approve their application because they don't meet in July and August. So I said, here's a solution. Why don't you meet? We have an application in front of you. How about you meet? But so the first piece of legislation was to say that co-op boards, once you have an application, have 15 days to tell you whether or not that application is complete, and then have 60 days to say yes or no. So that was a compromise. We also wanted to make sure that there was a reporting requirement to the county's Human Rights Commission, so that we could start to collect some data, because what co-ops say is there's no bad reason ever. There's never a fair housing reason. We're already, we're already governed by fair housing laws. We never, ever, 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 ever deny anyone for a reason that is not a good reason. But even when we were having this discussion with some co-op boards, we heard some reasons that were, not illegal, but also like a little wacky. So one that comes to mind is someone told us that they denied an applicant because he wore flip-flops, and they didn't like the sound that flip-flops make. Now, flip-flop wearers are not a protected class, but that is a little bit of, I would call, a frivolous reason. And another one that I thought was kind of funny was, you look like someone who might get a cat. Now that could actually border on protected classes, because what was the message? You're an old lady, I don't know exactly what that message was, but these co-op board members were very happy to sit at our table at a recorded committee meeting and tell us these things. So we made a compromise and took out reporting the reason, but gave a 2-year window of gathering this data. So the legislation was designed to sunset at the end of this year. So we had to take this up and see what was working, what was not working. And we really realized that we do need to have some kind of reporting of the reason for people being denied. And it's not only about fair housing laws, it's also about transparency and good governance, because it's sort of the same thing as if I'm going to say, I'm your county legislator, and I'm going to pass a law that says no dogs are allowed in Westchester County that are bigger than 20 pounds. I couldn't just say, I'm going to pass this law and not tell you the reasons why. That's not how elected representatives, which co-op boards are your elected representative. You should have information about how they're making their decisions. And if you don't like the fact that decisions get made on things like you look like you might have a cat, or we don't like flip-flop wearers, that's something that you should know before you have to vote for the co-op board again, right? So it really is also about just good governance. And I understand that it's a volunteer job to be on a co-op board. The co-ops told us that we were going to have an exodus of people. No one would ever want to be on a co-op board, but we didn't see that happen in the 2 years that we've had the time laws. And so now we're cleaning up the law. We're including the reason. BRI requested something that I think it makes the law much, much better, which is also to require all co-op board members have fair housing training, 2 hours a year of fair housing training. So we're really negotiating what that's going to look like and who's going to be able to give that training. And we also put in a requirement that is a little bit, it's not quite as clearly defined, because we do understand that co-ops sometimes have flexibility in their rules, but that when a co-op application is made, that the applicant and their agent should be allowed to know what their financial requirements are. So what their income requirements are, what their debt to income ratio are, what the credit score needs are. And co-ops can say, we have a little bit of room on credit score if your income is high. You know, they could make adjustments like they do, but the people should know that, because honestly, the worst thing is, you know, you have this transaction that's on hold, that people are, you know, they have to stop their lives. They can't move out of where they are, or they can't move, if they're the seller, they can't move to where they want to be. And it really is not good for business. It's not good for housing, and it's really not good for, it's just not good for transparency in our market. Now, we know that there are a lot of, and I'm really interested to hear, Dave, what your opinion is about the possibility of doing something like this in New York City, because we know that there's a lot of political resistance to it in New York City. But what I am hoping, this is my goal, this is going to get passed in Westchester County. I already have commitments from enough legislators and the county executive. What I'm going to ask everybody to do is to continue to write to representatives on my board to explain why this is a good law, because we do have a fairly organized letter writing campaign that is the opposition. But what's very interesting about that, so everybody who writes to me who's in my district writes or calls to me, I call back. And so a lot of times co-op owners will say, this is a terrible rule for co-op owners. And I'll explain to them what it is and how it gives you more ability to sell your shares when you're ready to sell. And almost to a person, they said, oh, that's good. Sometimes people worry about increased insurance, you know, liability, but again, a good way to not have liability around fair housing laws is to just not break them. So, you know, it's fairly straightforward, you know, what the protected classes are. So I'm very excited because, as I said, a long history of my heroes in the legislature have attempted to get this passed. We are going to pass it in Westchester County. It is already law in Suffolk County and a couple of other communities around the state. But what my goal is, from, you know, the time we pass it till the end of the year, is to encourage other communities in the state, counties, municipalities, to look at this and pass this. Because I think that what generally happens in New York State is that if a few key counties, Westchester, Suffolk, and Albany County, pass a piece of legislation, then there's enough political cover for a lot of state representatives to get behind it. Now, I'm curious, because I think this might be a little bit different because of the power of New York City. So I'm curious, for those who sell in that market, what you think about the possibility. But even if we had a New York State law that exempted the 5 boroughs, it would make fair housing much, much better in New York State. So that's my, you know, overview presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
That's great. And I forgot to mention that for those who are participating, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and Chris will keep an eye on that and let us know if there are any questions that need to be addressed right away. That's an excellent segue, Catherine. Thanks a lot. Dave, we're coming right to you to give us an overview. We just ended lobby day, and that was very exciting. We had opportunities to talk to our different legislators, even though it was via Zoom. Hopefully it'll be in person next year. But go ahead and tell us a little bit about what was discussed pertaining to the co-op legislations out there.
Thank you. So NYSAR has been at this fight for about 20 years for a fair and transparent application process. And Catherine, to your point, the current application process is so secretive, exhaustive, and cumbersome. And there are many buyers who get frustrated in the whole process. Their mortgage time's out. They're not being processed in a good enough time. So that creates disgust, and then they back away, and then the co-op gets to what they were looking to do by having this delayed timeline. But we've continually engaged New York City and state elected officials and legislative leaders. And currently we are still working with Jumaane Williams, a New York City public advocate, though we are facing technical and political challenges with the bill, as the Speaker of the Council is running for New York City Controller, and Jumaane just publicly endorsed his opponent. And with politics, things don't move when you're not on the right team. And I think that's one of our concerns currently with the bill there. In Albany, we proposed several bills. And the Senate Housing Chair, Brian Kavanaugh, this one's very promising. 2 bills he put out, both include a timeline, and one includes a timeline with a reason for denial. We know it's been so hard. The co-op council in Manhattan is very political, and they have a lot of clout, and they've been backing it. And their argument was that there'd be a lot of lawsuits coming out of this, but we haven't seen any. You know, the Suffolk County law has been there since 2009 with a reason for denial, and we haven't had any lawsuits against it. We're challenging it. So it is cumbersome, and there are so many stories where buyers just back away from the process.
Tessa, do you want to add to any of this, and then we'll keep it moving here?
I would, you know, and both of them touched on it, you know, the delays, right? And just right off the top of my head, school, getting kids enrolled in school, leases expiring, job changes, marriages, all of life still happens. And in a normal purchase option, there's a timeline, and you either get that contract accepted or you don't, and you're able to plan your life. Whereas when you are tied up for months and months in one of these, you know, co-op transactions, and you're just waiting to hear, there are pieces of your life you can't put together. And, you know, we kind of started off with a definition of co-ops, but there's a very important difference between co-ops and, again, other traditional primary residence purchases that actually makes it harder to find the fair housing violations. And but Catherine and Dave touched on this, but you know, what we saw with the Newsday Long Island Divided is they use what's called paired testing. And that's a pretty standard way of checking for fair housing problems within real estate. You send 2 different testers of 2 different classes out to same agents and ask about properties. Co-op purchases are not open to this. Before you get to the point to where you could potentially be testing, you have signed contracts, you've made mortgage commitments, you put down sizable down payments, and then you might get to sit for an interview process. So this is not open to testing. So that is why we have to look at transparency legislation to add back the protections of fair housing into a transaction that is not transparent to it the way other transactions are. So, you know, going back to our people whose lives are on hold, you know, maybe they're waiting to get married, maybe they're waiting to start a family, maybe they're waiting to enroll their kids because they want to get them into this school district or that. Why are they being denied? And we can't check that process. You've talked about the scattering of bills across the country or across the state. And yeah, we've got Westchester, Suffolk, NYSAR. I went through and I analyzed all of these bills, and there's something really interesting that is worth noting about every one of these bills. Talk about minimum requirements, talk about minimum bars. Here's what the bills all have in common. Acknowledge you received the application.
Absolutely.
This is a pretty low bar in a normal transaction, correct? If I submit a contract, I know within 24, 48 hours that contract has been presented, or I've been told when it will be presented. We're just asking for an acknowledgement that you received it. And then the second one is that you respond. Talk about, again, a low barrier here. In a normal transaction, if someone is hoping to buy a place to live, you don't even know you expect the minimum of, you go, we've got this and we'll present it, and here's your answer. These are an expected part of the transaction. With co-ops, we're having to enforce it through legislation. So that's part of why today's discussion is so important.
I think that, and thank you very much, Tessa, and to all of you. Catherine, I'm going to come back to you, because a part of what we look at as a realtor on this end also is some of our board members may not be fully educated about the process and what they're looking at. So yes, you did mention the fair housing training possibility of 2 hours for the co-op board members, but what else should we be trying to get at in terms of them being able to read a financial statement, for example? They ask for it, but they're not really aware or understand that process. So what do you think else we should be doing here?
Well, I think you really see, once you've done even just a handful of co-op transactions, that co-op boards are really different from each other. So some have professionals who do know how to do things, and some really don't. Some it's more, I'm going to say, crony-ish. It's the same people for a very, very, very long time, and they have their own ways. So I think that even just the adding of the 2 hours of fair housing training, we were going to ask also for other types of training, like implicit bias training and other types of financial training. But I'm happy to start with this because I do think even just this idea of, you might just doing it the way you've always done it might not be actually the best way for you to serve your fellow shareholders, but also really in compliance with the law. As Tessa said, it's very hard to suss out some of these things where there is some implicit bias that people are just not acknowledging because frankly, the whole point of implicit bias is that you're not really aware of it until you're made aware of it, right? It's institutional. So I think one of the best things for, especially right now, the way the real estate market is, where sales are so accelerated, and also just where we are culturally, I think that people understand that it shouldn't be that you get to pick your neighbors. It should be that everyone is given an equal opportunity. Now, we're not saying if somebody doesn't have the money, won't be able to pay the monthly fee, that you should consider them. No, that's a very legitimate reason to not. But I think also one of the things that really inspired me as I started working on this law is also people who are trying to sell their co-ops. Now, we had the broker in my office said he had a co-op that he had 5 buyers for. And so to Tessa's point, like that really jammed up the person's ability to, they wanted to retire. That person's ability to leave New York State, to go to a place that was warmer for his health. And, like the co-op board doesn't really understand that they are not serving their shareholder, the person to whom they're beholden, well, by not doing that. And whether or not, there were a couple of specifics about that situation, but there's always specifics about every situation, right? So I think we just really have to make this whole process more transparent. And I think we are much more sensitive now, even than 4 years ago when I first got into real estate, or 5 or 6 years ago where we first passed source of income legislation in Westchester, which now is a statewide rule. That some of these transactions are really not serving society very well in the way that they're being conducted. I mean, I am embarrassed as someone who's been in public office for as long as I have, which is almost 20 years. When I read that book, Color of Law, how much I did not know. And I think there's just a great heightened awareness of how real estate, to Tessa's point, has been used to separate people for a very long time. And we're at a place right now in our country, I think, where we're just ready to take a hard look at that. And this is, as Tessa said, this is actually a small step. Saying we're going to tell you what the financial requirements are is not like, we're going to let you into the vault and tell you the combo to the safe. It's really just basic. It's basic information that any other, arm's length transaction, it wouldn't even be an issue to get. So I just feel like we have to be part of this evolution and really push the fact that things need to be done with better governance, with more transparency, and with more consideration, frankly, for both sides of the transaction.
Thanks a lot. And Dave, I'm going to bring you in here because I know I'm putting you at the NYSAR level because you are our current president and we're looking to you for leadership. And I know Mike Kelly, our government affairs director, has been very, very pivotal in pushing a lot of what we as realtors are looking for to get done. So where do you see our process building up on what has already been done and moving things forward to help both the consumer and us? But how key here would be, how are we going to educate both parties about the process so that we are successful in getting some push behind this, moving it forward?
And to Catherine's point, it's getting at this at the county level, at the township level, and then that swell will continue to build. Unfortunately, it was 2009 when Suffolk, and it took a long time for us to get to Nassau County. And it was the the societal change right now where they recognize the problem. So Nassau County came on board. Granted, it's a timeline, but no reason for denial. Things that realtors could do, and we just had our lobby day up in Albany. We had over 330 realtors in New York State speak to the legislators on these issues. And that's a huge task. They want to hear from the people they represent, the voters. And we are lucky in New York State. We have a seat at the table. You mentioned Mike Kelly. Mike Kelly has a great relationship with all the legislators and the leaders of each party. When we met the other day, every legislator had mentioned how our advocacy efforts are so strong in New York State. We're not out there like the NRA for the guns. You know, we're out there as the voice of the homeowner to try to do what's right for everybody. And it's very refreshing when we go up to lobby day, whether it's in Albany or in Washington, D.C., we're speaking on behalf of the homeowners. The homeowners don't have a union. We're their voice. And that's what realtors could get involved in.
Okay, great. Catherine, I'll come back. And Tessa, if you want to jump in, go ahead. Do you want to add to any of this, Tessa?
I would just, I would just toss out a little bit of the scale that I happen to have in front of me. We're talking about the challenges. You go, okay, well, how much is that? So, for Long Island Board of Realtors, we are Nassau and Suffolk, but also Queens. And so when I look at our last 3 years worth of sales for those 3 counties, in Suffolk's co-ops are just across the board about 2.5%. It's a very small percent in Suffolk. But when we get to Nassau, we're between 6% and 7.5%. So that's a good chunk of sales. But when we talk about Queens, it has been consistent, 30%, almost a third of all sales in Queens. One of the most diverse boroughs, are diverse counties in the country, possibly in the world. 1/3 of sales is co-ops, and we can't help the buyers enforce their fair housing rights because we can't see into the transaction. We can't, because that's what it comes down to is buyers do have fair housing rights. Co-ops operate differently, but they have the same rights. But if you don't know how to enforce them, if you don't know why you're being denied, if you're not even being denied, you're just left to linger until you wander off. The scale of this is important.
Okay, so Catherine, I'm going to come down because you did mention BRI. What exactly is that group and what are they about? Because I do know, but most people may not.
Yeah, so they're an organization that we have worked with on sort of the other side. They represent the co-op boards. But I think it's interesting, again, from the two years ago when we passed this law now to what we're doing, that I think there is an acknowledgement that some of the arguments that they made, didn't come to pass. It didn't come to pass that no one was willing to serve on a board. It didn't come to pass that insurance went up. We didn't see any compelling evidence in any other community that those things happened. So I think that in this go around, they still don't like that we are including a reason, but they are much more aware that things do have to change things, and we haven't heard any like parade of horribles about how the timeline has really impacted any particular co-op. Now, part of our provision is that we ask for denials to get reported to our Human Rights Commission within 15 days of rejection. We do not know if that is actually happening, right? Because sometimes changes in regulations take a while to kind of filter into the culture. So this piece of legislation actually allows for the levy of fines if the Human Rights Commission discovers by some other means, because of course, real estate agents and people on both sides of the transaction can also report the rejection. So we're interested to see basically if people who, if this does change the mindset of agents. So I think an advocacy program for realtors will be very helpful to say, hey, did you know you have these rights? If you do you have a timeline where you have to get rejected. If you don't receive the information that you're requesting on the financial requirements, that there's a mechanism by which to complain about that. And that's particularly good for people who are selling if it happens that they just are left to linger. to know that there's recourse for that. So I think we really just have to keep moving forward with respect to giving people this information. Now, I guess, that's a stunning statistic in Queens, Tessa.
Yeah.
So now I feel like, it is pretty important to get New York City included in this legislation, because that's really, really, really impacting people. I was born in Flushing, the most diverse community in
Well,
the world.
Let me break down the data I pulled. I had to talk with my staff because we were trying to figure out what should be in and what should be out, right? So of course, single family residence. Not everybody who buys a single family residence is buying it for, to live in. They may be buying it for investment properties, but generally, if someone buys a single family. So we included single family co-ops. We actually looked at residential 2-family, and we had a decision to make. And we thought, well, they could be buying it to live in one side and rent out the other. Maybe it's completely investment, but we think that there's a chance that that's primary residence. So we included in residential 2-family. And then of course we included in condo. So we did not include residential 3-family, where we're getting into multifamily, and we didn't include commercial and land. So we included every category that we can reasonably think might be a primary residence. And if you question the residential, the duplexes, well, then that percentage is going to go up. Then, co-ops is an even larger percentage of that. So it's, we cast a pretty, what we thought, fair and wide net to come up with that percentage. But we know we're netting some investment properties in there.
Wow, that's huge. Now, how do we go about, and I'm coming to you, David. I know it's a challenge. You've already mentioned it's a challenge, but how do we go about, for example, getting REBNY on board with something like that, since they are such a powerful force in New York City market?
It is a concern. And they're not the only powerful source. I know you guys deal with BRI for the coast, but in Queens, there's a co-op council presidents organization. Lucky enough, we've earned a seat at the table, and the conversations are happening, and they're facilitated by Assembly Braunstein in Bayside, who's been an advocate for us, but he's not going to sponsor or sign on to a bill if it adversely affects his population of co-ops, because their co-op presidents are a large body of voting people. There's buildings that represent 1,000 families, and to a legislator, as Catherine probably knows, that's huge. So he's not going to overstep his bounds and do something like that. So that's a concern. We are trying to get them on board, and REBNY is a powerful lobbying firm as well. They do good jobs too. And a lot of times we are on the same line and same issues with them. But this one is a tough one. And to the stats that Tessa mentioned, I would argue Manhattan is probably 50% co-ops, if not even greater. So New York City definitely needs to be included. They don't deserve a carve out.
So what sort of marketing should we use to try to get at the consumer so they understand what we are trying to do? And it's not only about making money, it's about making sure that if I'm selling my property, I have the opportunity to get it sold.
Yeah,
what sort of marketing? What do you think? Go ahead, Kat.
Oh, I think that that's a really key point. As Dave mentioned, and this is what we heard too in opposition to this legislation, these organizations that represent the co-op boards, they might not be accurately reflecting what their actual shareholders might want.
Exactly.
And I have it was a small grouping of people for sure, but when we passed the timing legislation a couple of years ago, I probably spoke to, I would say 35 to 40 constituents who were shareholders in co-ops, who were told to call me or write to me to say, this is going to be terrible. It's going to be the end of the world as we know it. And co-ops are, affordable housing, which is true, especially in Westchester. And that, don't do anything that disturbs the ability for co-ops. But then when I explained the law to them and how it would benefit them for when they are ready to sell, they were pretty, I as I said, I only got one negative piece of feedback that said, well, our insurance is going to go up. And as it turns out, in those 2 years, we don't see any evidence of that happening. So I think it's really important to go a little bit beyond the co-op board organizations and explain to, you have to do it in a nice way. Of course, I am a politician, but explain to them that this is really going to benefit the financial health of your building, because it is going to allow for transactions to occur. We think that it's going to, to increase the desirability of co-ops in the market. So I think that the fears that people have are probably overstated, and that there's less understanding about the benefits of having legislation like this for co-ops themselves, certainly for co-op owners and even for co-op boards. And having fair housing training is like a little bit of insurance to
Yes.
say, if you, let's say you do get sued because someone said, they're being denied because they're a protected class, and you could say, oh, look, all of our members had fair housing training, and we are mounting a vigorous defense because we know the fair housing laws. I think that would help you in defending anything, but also as a way to alleviate that idea that their insurance is going to, or their liability is going to go so far up.
That's excellent. Tessa, you want to jump in here? See, you nodded quite a bit.
Yeah, I agree with everything she just said, and even she mentioned earlier potential for implicit bias, because, when you look at some of the reasons people get turned down for co-ops, there's the protected classes, but you shouldn't discriminate anyway, right? There's certain classes it's legally wrong to discriminate against, but flip-flop wearers, people with frosted ends, these should not be discriminated either, because again, when we're talking about co-ops, we're not talking about shares of stock. Yes, it's shares in a cooperative, but this is home. This is housing to people. It's just a different mechanism to get to housing. And so I think that's, having to take fair housing classes for these co-op boards, I think that it would be good for them to remember that they're there to serve people. Yes, they're shareholders, but also they're future shareholders. They're shareholders of today and tomorrow, right? And so remembering that people are the heart of that. People are the heart of what they do is a good thing. And we know that we want fairness in all treatment of people.
Well, excellent. And I want to stay with you, Tessa, because you and I also sit on the NAR Fair Housing Policy Committee. And I know we've had some conversations about what we would like to see from our National Association of Realtors in terms of support for something like this. And in some of the conversations, there have been situations brought up regarding other HOAs, homeowners associations, and how they've discriminated against potential buyers and sellers also. So do you want to bring that perspective into this conversation, please?
Sure. Again, so the National Association of Realtors is a fantastic organization. And it is my great honor to serve on the Fair Housing Policy Committee with you and a few other New Yorkers. They look at national policy, so they don't usually get involved in state level issues. New York is kind of an exception right now. Obviously, we are the center of the fair housing discussion, and we have been since November of 2019. So that means there's also a greater onus on us to show how to get it right, how to adjust housing practices to ensure their fairness going forward. We have been shown where it went wrong. Now we make it right. And so, it's these areas to where traditional fair housing is the minority of transactions, I guess. And again, 30% is a very large minority, but it's still a minority there. Looking at the areas where fair housing can't be applied the way it can in other things. And so that's how this HOA conversation and statewide co-op. And, if anybody's listening, you're hearing us talk kind of back and forth between local, county levels, and then also a statewide. And there are two separate pushes. One does not negate the other. We need to fight this on both fronts. We need to keep pushing in our local municipalities to get actual fairness, which includes, someone mentioned earlier that the Nassau bill didn't include the reason yet. But so that means we're not done there. And then when we look at the statewide, people think about states, people are not necessarily so specific as to this town, or this block. So we know that agents are licensed statewide. We know that people might look in several different markets. So having a consistency, a uniformity is important. And so that's where we've asked NAR if they wouldn't mind at least taking a look at our issue and seeing if they don't have something to say. Because at the end of the day, and going to the co-op training. If there was a uniform standard across the state that ideally includes all of these provisions, it is so much easier to train them. It's so much easier to make sure that they're hitting their deadlines. It's so much easier to inform our public what to expect, what those deadlines are, rather than, again, this patchwork. Oh, well, I have this here, but I don't have it here because I moved 2 towns over. So having this conversation at the national level about statewide issues, and then also having this statewide conversation about our local issues is huge to getting it top of mind. And as Catherine said, and you said, to some degree, we do need to inform the shareholders of co-ops. They may not understand that the co-op is not working in their own best interest, perhaps in a narrow perspective, but not in the wider perspective. And so increasing that perspective for folks, I think, is a big role for us.
That's excellent. And Dave, I'm going to come to you because, our state, not all parts of our state have co-ops. So sometimes the statement is, well, it doesn't affect me in any way, so why should I get involved? So I'd like to get your point of view on that. And I know Mike is listening somewhere. He's probably on this. So I'm not going to drag him into this, but I want to know your perspective on when I say, well, it has nothing to do with me. Why should I be supportive of this that affects downstate or that affects down county or whatever it is? What's the conversation that we are having with our fellow members here?
Sure, and it's not about cooperative housing. It's about fair housing. It's about maintaining that as an attainable housing. This is the first level of entry for many people for housing. And when it's not fair and it's not transparent, it doesn't matter whether you have those in your area or not. It's still a concern. And it's a huge concern about fair housing that NAR made it its a priority. In 2019, they had accountability, culture change, and training, and they called it ACT. So if NAR feels that we need personal training and accountability, so does our co-ops. And every realtor knows what needs to happen. I don't think we have that concern about whether they have co-ops in their area or not. It's about fair housing.
Okay, I appreciate that. So now we have come around, and I think bottom line, what I'm getting from all of you is we do need to have multiple prongs out there. We have to educate our membership. We have to educate the public, but we do have very powerful voices in these coalitions, BRI and what you have out there fighting against us, because sometimes we do get the negative information saying there's a fire out here. You need to stop these realtors from putting this information out and trying to take your co-op sale from you. We've talked about educating the board members. What about the management companies? What role do they have here? Because they're the ones who are getting the application first. And sometimes they don't even look at it right away. So what do you think we should be informing them about? Because they know what Westchester has with regards to the law. Whether or not they're in compliance, again, is another thing. So what do you think we should be doing with the management companies to let them know that we are looking at it, if anything?
One thing I think we should do is streamline the applications and make a uniform application for the state. I know it's a huge task and a big undertaking, but one of the things that I don't like to see in these applications, when they're submitted, they're asking for photo ID.
Yes.
That lends itself to so many concerns. So let's go to the co-op boards and say, don't ask for photo ID. Maybe have it when you interview the person, because you want to make sure they're the person that's in front of you, but not at the application submission.
Well, that has been a suggestion made, that if we had uniform applications and uniform forms statewide, it might help in making sure that we are all practicing pretty much the same thing, because we can say we have, and we do have some state forms that have already been made uniform out there. So suggestion to have these co-op applications uniform would be a wonderful thing, and removing the requirement of photo would be another thing that we have to consider doing. So we want to be active about it. We want to advocate for the public and make sure they understand what we are about, and hopefully we are able to help them. Chris, do we have any questions at this time before we keep it?
We do not.
Okay, great. So now what I'm going to come to is, Catherine, you have the legislation. Hopefully we're going to be able to help you push it forward. What are you looking for us, from us, as your fellow realtors? What are you looking at us for? How can we help you move this to the next level?
Yeah, so this is the timeline. We're going to have what I hope is going to be our final committee discussion on Monday at 1 p.m. The next board meeting, assuming that we are able to get it passed through committee on Monday, our next board meeting is going to be May 10th. Is that correct? I'll just take a quick look to make sure I'm not giving you the wrong date. So at May 10th, we would set the public hearing, which would then happen on May 24th. So basically between Monday and the 24th, what I'd love to see, and we can send you some bullet points if you want bullet point language, but you know, HGAR and all the other, or you know, all the realtor organizations really, I think already know the talking points, but we really want people to write about why realtors and clients are supporting this, focusing on fairness, focusing on transparency, and focusing on good governance. Now, you know, Tessa had mentioned there's other types of prejudice. The reality is if you're a co-op shareholder and you don't know that your co-op board is looking at things like what footwear people wear, you're not being served by your elected representative. So people, even if it's a reason that is an allowable reason, everyone should know how these decisions are getting made. And I love that whole idea of culture too, because I do believe that even in the past 2 years since we've had this law, the culture has changed. People are looking at things in a deeper way to say, okay, you know, we didn't think that there were biases, but you know what? Maybe there are. Maybe we need to be looking at the way we do our business a little bit differently. And I love the idea of the uniform application, because I think a lot of what happens in these co-ops is not intentionally, you know, doesn't have bad intentions, but it's like a process that's been sort of perpetuating itself for years and years and years in particular co-ops, and nobody's had the reason to look at that process. And that's what this law, I think, is intended to do, to say, hey, look at where maybe you need training. Look at where maybe your processes aren't correct. If you haven't been following the law as it exists now, well, guess what? Now there are penalties for not following the timing. And we're going to, with our Human Rights Commission, we're going to push out this information so that our clients as realtors and people who are shareholders understand what their rights are now within this transaction. So I'd love to see over the next 3 weeks a lot of communication. The more personal, the better. But I also think volume is important, because you know, the co-op boards who are opposing this do have a lot of their shareholders writing to us. Again, we will listen to both sides. That's the point of the public hearing. And I am not alone on my board in saying I will contact people if they write to me, my constituents write to me, I do contact them. But I do think it's important for people to understand exactly what the intentions of this legislation are and how it really does benefit us individually, not only as sellers or buyers of co-ops, but also societally, that we do want to have a more fair, more transparent, less discriminatory way for people to get onto the property ownership ladder. So keep those cards and letters coming.
That's great. Tessa, do you want to jump in? Because I have a question for you, because sometimes when our buyers get denied or rejected or whatever the feeling, when we get that information that they didn't get approved by the board, they're very disappointed. And in trying to get them to even fight back, get the energy to fight back, they're so disgusted with the process that it really takes a lot of work to get them to that step, that they're mad, they're upset, they're walking away. What do you think, or where do you think, looking at it from an AE point of view, CEO point of view for your board, LIBOR, what do you think you could be putting out there for your membership that would encourage them to encourage their buyers or sellers who have gone through this difficult denial process? I don't want to say rejection. Rejection is just so sad. So what do you think we should be saying to our buyers and sellers if we were on your board as to how they can move forward?
That's a great question. And as you're talking about first-time buyers, I'm mentally splitting them into two categories, because there's the first-time buyers who are also first-time homeowners in their families. And then there's first-time buyers who come from homeownership. I don't think that second group is as likely to be discouraged as the first group,
Oh,
right? Think about that, because if you come from homeownership, you know that, okay, I know that buying is a hassle. I know that there's difficulties. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen, but then you have the rights and privileges of ownership for a period. I think probably who we're seeing get more frustrated are the first generation home buyers, first time buyers, because they're doing something that hasn't been done. It's not part of their family culture. It's not part of their family history. It's not part of their personal history. So they're taking what they think is a chance. They're moving forward, and to have those efforts snubbed I believe it can be fatal in some cases. And, housing is one aspect. There are other areas to where when people are trying to rise out, that they can easily be, discouraged and go, okay, maybe this isn't for me. And that is my biggest concern with home ownership, whether it be co-op, single family, condo, whatever, because, when we look at what the wealth of the average renter is and the wealth of the average homeowner, we are looking at two very different animals. When we look at savings rates and when we look at 401k rates, we know that is not where most families or individuals' wealth is. It is in their property. It is in their home ownership. So that category of first-time home buyers who are also first generation to try to get into a home, they're not just being discouraged from this one act. They're being discouraged from an act that may literally impact their grandchildren through generational wealth and generational home ownership. So the answer to the question is, I think anything we can do to stop them from being discouraged and to go, what's on the other side is worth it. Whether it's this property or the next property, we are going to get you into somewhere, and here's the benefits of it.
that's outstanding. Dave, what sort of discussion are you having with your agents when somebody comes to you and say, they've gone through the process and, my buyer got rejected. So now what discussion are you having with me if I'm your agent in your office in order to try to figure, because we all know that there are avenues we can, I don't know what the process is. Let me go back. What's the process in Long Island if you get a rejection from a co-op board? I know with Westchester, we have the Human Rights Commission, and they are taking some numbers. I forget what the last count was. I'm not sure. But then what are we doing?
It was like 530, I think.
We had 530, but what are we doing with that information, Catherine? And I'll come back to you, David. Go ahead.
So the compromise that we made when we put the timing in was to collect information for the 2 years and then see whether or not we needed the reason. When we found out that we had over 500 in the 2 years and a couple of months that this has been in place, we realized, yes, we do need to know what the reasons were, because it was much more than we were sort of anticipating based on testimony that we got at the committee table. So where we strengthen the law, and where I would recommend other laws, similar laws, strengthen, is to have a penalty for not reporting in the rejections in a time. Now, laws, just because something is a law doesn't mean that everybody knows it, right? So there is a rollout education. When we do pass this law, we definitely will want to partner with the realtor organizations and the Human Rights Commission and other types of organizations, to Tessa's point, to make sure that people know their rights. But we don't anticipate that it's going to go from, 50% compliance to 100% compliance immediately. I think it is a process where we roll out, and there's some discretion about fines. But if a co-op, we find out that a co-op is just routinely not reporting their rejections, then it is good to have the stick too, not only the carrot, to say, hey, you're not complying with this law. It seems willful at this point because we've heard of 6 rejections that you haven't reported. You've got to do better.
Okay, that's good. So back to you, David. What's going on in terms of, the reporting on the process in Long Island, if we have any, and how is that being implemented?
There is no process Suffolk County, it's just that the notice is given for the grounds of rejection, but there's no reporting to HRA or any other division of human rights or anything. Though, to get back to what happens when an agent tells us, or we have conversations or masterminds about getting buyers approved, a lot of it is trying to make sure we present the buyer in its best light. A lot of times it's the application's faulty and the co-op uses that as a grounds for dismissal. So there's a lot of training involved. I know in my brokerage, and I'm one of the ones who teach it, is on how to get someone approved by a co-op board. And sometimes that means getting a credit repair done before they submit their application, so the scores are more in line of what the co-op may be looking for. And what we do personally is I try to make sure I make friends with the management office. And sometimes after denial, they say, well, we can't tell you what happened, but they tell you what happened. And when they do that, they're trying to say, hey, we're not discriminating. It was a bad application, or the income requirements weren't there, or there was something funky. So if we're able to get that done beforehand and train the purchaser and get an application that's a A+ application in, we have less applicants being denied for home ownership.
You know, but that's what Tessa said earlier, which was say such a low bar. But in terms of giving us the information for qualifying, you know, let us know you got it. Let us know what your criteria is. Let us know what we should be doing to properly package that buyer for that board. But sometimes we can do everything right, and then they may or may not show up for that meeting, and then it goes downhill. So I guess again, going back to that, it's all about the education and the presentation of the material to us. And I have to stay in New York State. I know New York City has some legislation out there, or that's being promoted, I guess, with regards to the co-ops. Can you expand on that a little bit, David, or did I get that information wrong with regards to co-ops in New York City?
I don't understand the question. What did you say?
Do we have the legislation? Do we have legislation out in New York City regarding co-ops?
Well, we're trying to push through with Jamani Williams, but the concern is he endorsed the speaker's opponent for New York City controller. So I don't think that's going anywhere. And at the state level, we're also frustrated that Kavanaugh didn't include the co-op bill in his fair housing package that passed through the Senate. In the Assembly is too busy right now trying to figure out what's going on with Cuomo and his investigation. So they're not really acting on the fair housing bills. So what we want to do is hopefully by the end of the session in June in Albany is to get everybody on the same page, get the Senate on the same page with the Assembly, with doing what's right for fair housing. And we're working very hard at trying to do that.
Okay, that's good. So Tessa, do you want to give us a quick overview of where you think we can go with our efforts to improve home ownership in this co-op arena? I know you've said a lot in terms of education, and it is a low bar for some of us to get people across board. But then where do you see us at all levels? And yes, 2 or 3 pronged approach to it, but give us an overview as to what you think, we should be doing, how we should be doing it, if you can. And then I'll go to Catherine for that. And then we will do definitely wrap up on that.
Well, you could always do more, but I do think that we're on the right path, which is, we've identified areas in housing that possibly fair housing issues are not being detected or being raised. So we're working on those. Again, we talked about the fact that this is very often the first level for homeownership, first level entry. And we talked about the 2 different types of first-time buyers that there could be. So making this process transparent and not time cumbersome. Because again, when we talk about those first-time home buyers, that means they've got a lease somewhere, right? Probably. So making it to where it actually goes forward in a timely fashion with reasonable expectations that everybody knows at the outset. I know that sounds crazy because that's how most transactions work, right? You kind of know what the seller's looking for, you make your offer, and then you decide whether or not you can come to a deal. The closer we can get co-ops to functioning that way, the better off the public is going to be by getting their feet in and not being intimidated by the process. The better, move up buyers are going to be when those co-op first-time buyers are ready to move into, their next home. So, it really does, and Catherine and David both pointed this out, it benefits everyone up and down the row when people are able to freely buy, sell, trade, lease, exchange property. And so getting co-ops as close to that ideal as possible, it's, we keep at it.
Fantastic. Catherine, want to add?
Well, I've already talked about the education, but actually in hearing this conversation, I had another thought, which is that, we see a lot of community-based organizations doing home buyer like seminars, telling people, get your credit in line, how to save for a down payment, all that stuff. We should probably do a little module to offer to people about specifics of co-op buying, because it is, I think it gets mentioned that, it's a, it has this additional step of having to get it approved by the board, but I don't think people really realize how different the process is, and B, what their rights are, which will be increasing in Westchester County. So this is giving me another little idea of how to really get that information out using other community-based organizations, especially to Tessa's point, first time home buyers in their family, people who don't necessarily know this. So I think that that's a really significant population for us in Westchester County as realtors. And it's also something that really increases the general economic prosperity of our county, of our state. It's really a good thing to do. So taking away a to-do item from this webinar.
Let me stay with you, Catherine, because I know you had also previously mentioned culture.
Yeah.
What did you mean by culture?
So I think that for a lot of people, and when I trace, my own personal growth and learning over the past several years, I think there are things that were grossly unfair in our society that we just didn't think about. And now there's an increased look at how those things are really impacting the fairness and the equity, and prosperity of everyone. So I mean, I don't want to go off into my, political tangent too much, because I know this is not the appropriate place for it. But there are a lot of institutions that have built-in unfairness that we, especially, middle-aged, we kind of are used to, but really merit a relook. And this is one little area where we can actually make change. So that's why I'm very excited to do it.
Exciting. David, you want to give us, because I think that it's very surprising. I could go on and on, but I think that you panelists have just given us so much information that I don't want to keep beating a dead horse. So David, you're going to give us an overview of what you think. And then if we don't have any questions, I'm going to let you off early. Isn't that great? Then you can all go make some more money, but I'm not going to do that. David, come on, wrap us up here.
Well, these are very important issues to society and to fair housing, and I urge the listeners to speak to their city and state lawmakers on this issue and remind them it's a fair housing issue. And when NYSAR gives the call for actions and the local boards give the call for actions, we need to get those numbers up. Shamefully, we're low. So we have to do a better job at that.
I want to thank you all. Chris, do we have any questions? Because I think that the information received has been terrific.
We don't.
Oh, that's exciting. All right. We have had, and I'm not going to keep, I know everybody's very busy here, and I want to thank you all for taking the time out to come educate us. I do want to say that this situation with co-ops is fundamental to our business. Our kids and friends and families graduate from college, and this is the entryway into home ownership. Yes, it was said first generation home ownership, of course, wealth building, but again, the education, because every time I get a call from somebody who wants to buy a co-op, I need to explain to them what is involved in the purchase of a co-op. And they go, well, I didn't know I had to do all that. So it helps us to find a good way to try to educate the consumer. But I think also fundamentally as agents, we need to understand why. co-ops are so important to our business and how it increases a lot of pride in home ownership. We also have to be very aware of the fact that our protected classes are non-negotiable. We need to know them. They should never apply to how we do business. It's everybody gets an open door, everybody goes through the process and has an opportunity to set some roots down and get a piece of, I hate this thing, the American dream, but that's what it is. We want to be proud of our homes and we want to be proud of our neighbors and where we live. So community is huge. And I want to thank everyone here on this panel for bringing their different perspectives to the conversation. And Catherine, we are going to back you up. We will get the information and we will promote the heck out of it and make sure our buyers and sellers understand that this is a good thing for them. It is a
Thank you enough. Yeah.
So I appreciate the opportunity, guys, to have the discussion, and hopefully we will come back to this after June with some great news, Catherine, that at least there have been baby steps in that process. And David, as a NYSAR president, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be here. I want to thank NYSAR staff for making you available and you taking the time to be a part of the conversation, because you brought NYSAR's perspective, which of course, being on all these committees, I know and understand, but it never hurts to hear it again. And Tessa, CEO of LIBOR, thanks for taking the time out to be here. Of course, you brought a whole left-wing perspective to this, which was challenging in all aspects. It's always is to me, but it was good to have the conversation. So I want to thank all of you for being here. And for our participants out there, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and we will be happy to address that. Upcoming, we of course have, we're going to be talking about diversity and inclusion. We're going to talk about equity and versus equality. We will also be talking to Department of State to ask us, tell us about the 10 most important violations that they're seeing where realtors are concerned. And hopefully it's not fair housing, but since the Northeast is the talk of the country, we are doing our best to make sure we are in compliance. So I know LIBOR has a ton of fair housing courses and I participate in them. And I know HGAR also does. So I want to thank everybody out there. And I am letting you off early because we don't want to be repetitive. And this has been amazing. Thank you very much, Catherine, David, and Tessa. Have a good one. Thanks a lot.